clip. First, poso, Sasānēhsaeh M. My name is Sasānēhsaeh M. I am from Ram Indian Reservation in Wisconsin. And I also want to honor the Ho-Chunk Nation, which is the land that we're on right now, as well as the other 12 nations in Wisconsin, right? If we're talking about colonization, I think we need to acknowledge that. And hopefully, in your practices and things that you're doing, you think about those things, right? You think about where we are. We couldn't be here if the Ho-Chunk weren't kind of impacted by colonization in the ways that they were already. So just to give you some of that. Yeah, I'm glad to be back. Born and raised in Wisconsin. I was in Minnesota for 8 years, so it's really, really good to be back and see you all. And to see you, I didn't think I really thought it was going to be like 30 people. So thank you for being super interested in this topic. I'm excited. This is my dissertation topic. This was something very close to me. Those who are in PhD programs right now, I speak all the time, and even master's programs, I couldn't have did this if it wasn't super close to me. This was my experience as an undergrad. This is my experience as a practitioner, as an administrator. I worked for universities and colleges and universities for about 11 years. So, you know, I'm part of this. And also a researcher. I just really couldn't do this work if it wasn't that close to me. You know, sometimes people say it's taboo to say, you need to be objective and all that stuff. But for me, I had to be really close. So a lot of this work really hit me in very different ways. And so I'll be telling some stories in there because that's kind of how I like to talk about my work. I just put this slide up here, one, because numbers. I know maybe some of you data people are out here. But we've known for years that Native American and Alaskan Native students, their educational attainment is lacking a bit, right? So that 33%, if people can't see it, sorry if you can't see it. I also will provide slides later, so if you would like these slides, I will provide them to WISCAPE and publish them. But that 33% has less than our high school only, which is probably the bigger out of the population, right? Again, this is just setting the stage. I don't think this is new information. I think we know this, right? I'm not saying anything new. I say this all the time. I'm not saying anything new. I think people know this happens. For some reason, it's just provocative now. Or the way I put it is provocative. There's tons of scholars before me that have said these same things. And the 15% have bachelor's degrees or higher, right? It's one of the smaller, along with Hispanic, Latino, Chicano populations. Again, setting the stage, I don't think this is new. I think you knew that, that's why you're here, right? If you wouldn't be here, you would be wondering what those numbers were. So, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is here, we would commonly say that's an achievement gap. That's what we would commonly say, right? One of the things she's talked a lot about is moving this idea of an achievement gap to an education debt. Because with an achievement gap, it makes these disparities ahistorical. So it really removes the history, the oppression, the things that happen to these populations out from under the kind of situation that is going on, right? And it also makes it an individual problem. I was just talking to my colleague yesterday about this. When we talk about this achievement gap, we put it on the students. We put all of this inequality on the students. And if you know me or been in meetings with me, I'm really about pushing the system and pushing the institutions to be able to create change so it's not on the students, right? I'm a firm believer that we've created these institutions and we've created these spaces in a very harmful manner. And so hopefully we can think about what those are and move forward in a different way. And so what she does is she talks about the education debt. So she talks about it in a way where it examines the historical nature of what happened, right? It examines maybe the harms and the oppressions that have happened. It also, what I really like, is it forces accountability. It forces accountability. And so this really was the kind of the crux of how I kind of managed my dissertation. I didn't do a lit review. I did a historical overview of the 19th and 20th century citizenship and education policies. And so part of that was like, I wanted to see, moving forward, right, what's going on? Why do we continually struggle in these institutions? So history was a big reason why I look at the stuff that I look at, and I still go back to it. Because I think we haven't learned. We keep repeating history all the time. It just looks a little different, so we think it's new, right? I would argue we keep repeating the same things. And so one of the things that Gilborn, he talks a lot about is this idea of locked-in inequality. And that, to me, really kind of talks about this idea of an education system that creates this very unequal and almost stratified population, right? Everybody here, most of you, have access to this institution. You're very privileged in that way, right? A lot of maybe your family members or community members aren't here. So this idea of education stratifying in a very harmful way was used back in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so now we can't even see it, right? We can't even see the ways in which this institution creates inequality in a particular way. And so it's locked in. We see it as common sense. We see it as what is successful as a student, or what an institution runs on, right? And so this idea of, one, thinking about history, but also really examining these institutions within a historical context is super important to me. And one of the reasons why I think it all exists is colonialism. Right? Again, no, that's not something I hope if you're surprised, if you're not, because this is within the title of the talk. But really, all of this happens because of colonialism, and I want to contextualize because colonialism happens globally in different spaces. I'm specifically talking about colonialism in the United States, right? And so I'm a very big definition person. I won't get into like my methods because I think it's kind of boring. I think it's cool, but it may be boring to you all. But language is super important. So I wanted to give a definition so we're on the same page of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about colonialism. There are tons of different definitions, right? And so really, I always say this idea of the settler colonialism in the United States was based on this idea of creating wealth and creating the United States and America as a superpower. And two things had to happen in order for that to occur. They had to erase the people that were already on the lands. They had to, right? Because they needed to own it. They needed to take part of it. And one of the two of the ways they did it was one through actual genocide, and the other way is through education. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But simultaneously, so I talk about this sometimes too, enslaved Africans had to also happen as well. Because that's who created and generated the wealth, right? And so my friend and I, we do this talk called the Solidarity Question. And we talk about how particularly Black Americans, African Americans in the United States, how our histories are so linked. But sometimes we don't talk about it, or we don't talk about the ways in which we can be in solidarity with each other. And it's all because of settler colonialism. It's all because the United States, or the leaders of that time, dehumanized us in a particular way and created this situation where it's stratified, right? Sounds just like schooling, right? You're stratifying. You're continuing to stratify. And so what I'm going to provide next is more about kind of my timeline, right? What I was looking at. So this idea of a colonial education institution. So the two ends are basically citizenship, right? United States citizenship. In 1790, Native Americans, NA, were denied U.S. citizenship. And then in 1924, they were granted Native American citizenship. In the middle, that's where a lot of the social control through education was happening, right? So you have the government offering $10,000 to teach Native students. You have them giving financial institutions assistance to teach Native students. Particularly in 1867, in order for Native students, Native people, if they wanted to become citizens, they had to accept American ways of life. And so all of these different kind of policies were created for social control, right? This idea of removing them from their nations. It's this idea of deculturalization, and it's like this idea of elimination. And when I was sitting, I actually still have this from when I was doing my dissertation. Very visual person, so I have like all these things. During this process, like I said, it was really close to me. I used to go by Susie. So if folks here know me, prior to when I left, I went by Susie. Susie is the English version of Sasānēhsaeh. But when I was doing this timeline and looking at all this information, I used to get really sick to my stomach for obvious reasons, right? Like, wow, my ancestors are enduring a lot. But what I realized was when I was doing this timeline, I am a product of deculturalization. I assimilated, I'm doing a PhD, so I'm trying to do like, right, I'm doing the things that they want me to do. I'm actually an agent of the institution because I work for these universities. Like, I'm telling students to act in a particular way or do a particular thing to be successful. And so what I realized is like, holy man, like, this is, I'm researching like me, like, holy crap. And so at that time, I decided to really use my given name, which is my legal name. It's Sasānēhsaeh. It's like my legal name. I used it because it was easier. I used Susie because it's easier for people. I was colonized, right? Performing in a way that I didn't know. And so that's why I say this stuff is super close to me. It was really hard to write sometimes, but also really infuriating. And so the settler colonial project, again, is really basically trying to gain social control because they need to gain capital in a particular way. And so what I look at is how they do it through education institutions. And so this, if you're looking for good, like, boarding school kind of scholars, these three on the bottom are really good. They're really good scholars who do well, historians, but also do more theoretical kind of work. So just people who are interested in that, write that down. But really, right, this idea, particularly all the leadership and people who were thinking about the United States in a particular way, were thinking about education as social change. But social change to create this homogenous group of people to really erase Native students or Native people in a particular way, right? To assimilate us into this very Western white culture in order for land to be taken, right? It all goes back to colonialism. And I always tell people sometimes is when I do these talks, I talk about how it continues to go on until now, and how even right now, that fact that I got a PhD and the fact that I have these 3 letters, and that you're listening to me because I have these 3 letters, I bet you wouldn't be here. Well, maybe you would. Maybe some of my friends would be here. But you wouldn't be here if I didn't have it, right? Or the fact that you're sitting in rows, or what you wear, what the type of money you use, like those are all very colonized systems that we just don't think about, right? We just don't think about it in a particular way. But I was talking to some students and I was telling them, yeah, you know, after I thought about it, I feel like I'm in the Matrix. They were like, Matrix? What is that? I was saying, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to age myself a little bit, but I just can't unsee it anymore, right? I can't unsee it. And I'm not saying I'm not colonized, I'm not saying, and I'm just saying right now, like I see it in a different way, right? And it helps me navigate differently. And so it's going to take a lot of time to undo what that means. And so to get more academic, so the research questions that I looked at were, in what ways are today's institutions modern day boarding schools? But specifically what I want you to focus on is this idea of what it means to do school and what it means to be a student. Where did you learn how to be successful in school? Where did you learn how to be a student? I bet you've learned it in multiple places, but we don't question that, right? We don't question that when we're coming into these institutions who oftentimes people talk about liberation, they talk about coming here and getting critical thinking skills, but critical thinking skills for who? And to do what, right? And so I was really looking at how students learn how to be a student, because it's ingrained in us, and it's really, what I realized, it's really hard for them to think about that. It was really hard. They were like, I don't know, I'm just, this is just what I do. And I was like, no, think back part, where did you learn these messages? Because I think that's where stratification happens, right? That's where we start to separate. So what I ended up doing is some of the work that I won't get into my methods, but one of the work that I did do is I did focus groups with undergraduate Native students and graduate Native students. I particularly wanted graduate Native students because I wanted them to have a perspective. Like, you're choosing to come back, right? You're choosing to participate in this institution. So I wanted that kind of perspective. And one of the things that really I pulled out when I was doing my work was, one of my students was like, I'm a student, so I can't be Native. So she already put this dichotomy up, right? She was already thinking, I'm coming into this institution as a Native woman, but once I'm a student, I can't do that anymore. I'm sure somebody at orientation wasn't like, hey, you can't be Native anymore. Like, no, who told her that, right? How did she feel that? How did she know that? And a lot of the things this particular student said was this idea about showing up into spaces and having to be professional and take her Native identity off in order to get services. And that hit me really hard. I was like, wow, like, for a student to think that they have to come into this particular arena and go into a space to get services, and she feels like she can't be her whole self. Like, that's tough. So then it's this idea of schools have expectations of how students should be, right? Like, I think it's a very unspoken rule. Like, we don't talk about what we expect students to do until they don't do it. Then when they don't do it, it's about their deficiency, right? It's about what they do or not do. We don't think about what we as people at the institution do to create that divide. So again, one of the common themes, and again, this is not new information, is this idea of having to navigate these two worlds in a particular way. And so I picked out a couple quotes because I thought they were super interesting just to think about, right? So this student, I believe this student was one of the graduate students that I talked to. But they are even talking about, like, you know, we have to come in and we have to do this, but we know it's against who we think we are. So what does that mean? You're coming in, and one of the students actually said, I think it's interesting that we have to go to college, we have to be physically removed from our community to come do this stuff. And it, like, blew my mind. I was like, man, that's such a simple idea, but I never thought about it like that. This idea of being removed and having to endure without your family here, without the comfort of your culture, you're removing them, right? But even this idea of, you know, having to be in this space and just not it being a place to accept you in a particular way. Despite what diversity says, despite what inclusion says, because I have so many qualms about that, we can talk about it at a different time. But I think it's this idea of they're already knowing they have to navigate a space. Let alone try to figure out what college means to them, what grad school means to them. They already know this stuff, right? So imagine having to come in these spaces and have to, like, battle two systems in your head and decide one day what you're going to do. Feel like you're not Native, or feel like you're coming into a space where you're getting this degree. Degree for what, right? At what cost? And so this one, was really big for me, particularly at the bottom. The student is wrestling with this idea of indigenous knowledge and sharing it. What does that mean? We talked about cultural appropriation. We talked about use of it in a very assimilative and even genocidal way. But the bottom, I feel that all the time, right? It's like, but yeah, there's just something I wrestle with every single day. It's like, am I the good guy or the bad guy? Like the general public would say, yeah, going to college is great. You're going to get so many experiences. You're going to do these things. But again, at what cost and at what expense? And I work for university, so I'm the person telling these students what to do. So I definitely, even in my position now, there's so many things where I'm like, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel right. But if I don't do it, if I don't say anything, who is? So I'm constantly in this struggle, right? Again, despite this idea of inclusion, despite this idea of diversity that I think we like to talk about, but I don't think we're really true on what that means. So this is basically what I found when I was talking to the students. So this idea of student success is based in this very white ideology. So having to perform in a very white way. When I talk about whiteness, I'm talking more about power, right? I'm not talking about skin color. I'm talking about the power that really, white supremacy, right? I'm talking about whiteness in that way. This idea of being professional, having to really operate in a particular way in order to be successful in this institution. And again, at what cost? They talked a lot about removing, not fitting in, having a different worldview. You know, if you're not home, you know, if you're able to go back to your community, you're not home harvesting, you're not home connecting with your elders. That comes at a cost being here. And I know I was in Minneapolis for 8 years, and it was hard because I was away from my community, I was away from my family. Fortunately, I had a lot of great people who adopted me as, you know, their own, but it's not the same. So again, at what cost? I don't think we think about that. I think we think these institutions are very neutral, you know, they're all about social mobility. We don't think about the cost the students are really enduring while doing this. So, and if you have questions, definitely we can have a dialogue, because talking this much, not really good, but that's okay. So one of the things too for higher ed folks in the room, this idea of the hidden curriculum. If you haven't heard of it, look it up. It's really this idea of the unwritten rules. So that's what I was looking for. I was looking for these unwritten rules that were established in these institutions in a particular way, right? At a grant level, or even just in an office level, right? When you come into an office, what are the unwritten rules? And then what happens when students don't comply to those rules? What do? That more is super important to me. Or even like, you know, if you're a higher ed professional and you say, well, that student should know that, that's obvious. But did you tell them? Like, or even like instructors or faculty. You talk about learning outcomes, you talk about, you know, rubrics and giving grades, but did you tell them what it meant to get an A? Did you specifically say this is what I need? I would argue you're continuing to control them, because the people who know that information are going to move forward. They're going to stratify in a particular way. Most often are very white middle class norms. So this is just, I mean, you take a picture, you can't, so I won't stand it too long, but it's just the idea that we have culture perspectives, topics, culture expectations, rules. We have all these things that we don't talk about. Sure, we have orientation. I'm sure there's orientation here. We don't talk about these things. We talk about what it means to be in Badger. We talk about that's what we talk about. But we don't tell students how to navigate the institution in a particular way, right? We expect them to know these things. We expect that because they're educated, because they got in, that they should know these particular things. So I argue this is, again, based in colonialism. These institutions were created during the same time frame or close to when these boarding schools were happening. Why wouldn't those values and norms be subjected to these institutions? Why wouldn't it be the foundation of these institutions as well? And I say that all the time. I talk about, particularly in Minnesota, like some of their donors that helped them get out of debt back in the 19th, 20th century were slave owners. Like, you're telling me that didn't seep into the institutional knowledge or culture, right? Like, and we don't ask these questions. We don't ask these questions at all. So again, my big question, right? What does it look like to be successful in higher education? What does success really look like? And in particularly my study, I was looking at student and learning development outcomes, because I was trying to gauge, where do students learn how to be a student, right? How do they learn how to be successful? How do they learn how to do school? And that was kind of where the students kind of pointed me. So I did a discourse analysis. I studied language. So I looked at how these learning outcomes were written in different spaces. That's kind of a short version of what I did. It took longer than that, but so this is what I found, right? Like, this idea that we're so centered on this marketplace ideology. We're so centered on this, what the students do before they even get here. We talk, and then we let industry. So another kind of level to that, we let industry and corporations decide what those outcomes are. Because they say, oh, we talk to employers and this is what employers want. So we're letting the marketplace, we're letting money determine what success looks like at an education institution. It seems a little weird to me, right? And so that was a big thing, this idea of like, how much do you let employers, how much do you let industry, how much do you let money determine success on these institutions?
Is that a typo there where it says border? Shouldn't it be broader?
Probably. Thank you for pointing that out. So bringing to the next point, right? The citizenship ideology. This idea of being a global citizen. And that's really caught me off guard because I would say up until, I don't know, my 30s, I never thought of myself as an American citizen, no lie. Like, no lie. I went outside the United States, and they were like calling us American. I was super offended. My friends were American, and I was super offended. And my friends were like, how are you? I said, because I don't see myself as an American citizen. Like, I see myself as a Menominee woman. Like, and I didn't think about that until I was doing this. I was like, oh, that's why I felt super uncomfortable. Because we're training students to be citizens of what? The United States? Then what does that do? Are they thinking about what it means to be a citizen of their nation? So then they have to choose? But we don't talk about that. That's super harmful language to me, right? This idea of citizenship. Seeing that in the beginning, it took so long for natives to get citizenship before they had to be assimilated, they had to be acculturated into these schools before they could automatically get it. Sounds like boarding schools to me. So essentially, you know, what I was trying to find was what were the ideologies that really guided what it meant to be a student and how to do school. And so, if you think about boarding schools, it was about nationhood, right? We're creating this homogenous American group in the 19th, 20th century to, one, erase natives because they needed the land, right? Going back to colonialism, but also to create capital. We're creating capital because we wanted to be the largest, powerful nation. That's exactly what we're talking about now in 2016. This idea of citizenship, this idea of creating this global citizen. Again, I asked to whom and for what, and those questions we don't ever ask. Because we assume it's American, because we assume all these things, but that's harmful, right? That's that locked-in inequality. And the market-driven, right? We're thinking about the market in a particular way. Again, very parallel to what happened in the boarding school era. And so one of the things that I wrote about, I don't know, I could pass this one, but one of the things I wrote about is this how universities are complicit in colonialism. And particularly, what are the tools of control? What do we do to students? Right? We make them get the grades. We have specific kind of requirements for them to get out. But who decides what those are? Who decides what an A looks like? Who decides that it's a 2.0? Who decides that you have 120 credits? Who decides that? And what are those ideologies that are behind that? Do we ever ask ourselves that? Do we ever push back on that? No, because that's how it's always been, right? It's locked in. And so this idea of assimilation, I came across this notion of conditional hospitality. And it was super brilliant. I'll get you the scholar. I should have put her on here. But what it's basically saying is, when you're thinking about diversity, you're only allowing diversity on the condition that we can welcome you in the ways that we want to, and that you are celebrated in the ways that you allow us to. So essentially that you assimilate,
right? We'll welcome you only if you assimilate the ways that we need you to. Yeah?
I was going to say, isn't that poster a bit oversimplified? Because I think it's accepted as fact that many Native Americans in Oklahoma at least engaged in owning the slaves.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily a scholar in colonialism and slavery, but it's more about the idea behind it. So yeah, I agree. I mean, that's complex in itself, right? That I'm sure there's people out here who study that too, but that's definitely complex in itself. So it is super simplified, but hopefully for a reason, right? So you can think about it. And even the commodification of identities. I think about the student groups. I think about the student groups we have on campus who represent these different identities. We make them do the work for us. We make them show up and do programming. I'm looking at some students right now. We don't make them, but I feel like we make them do it because we're not stepping up and doing it for them. And they're here to be students. They're here to be successful. So even as we're assimilating them, we want them to do our work for us. It's time for us to say, no, we need to support them in a particular way, right? We commodify the identities all the time. You think about the powwow. How many pictures are taken at the powwow? How many people come to the powwow? Great cultural exchange. I'm not saying don't come, but think about the commodification of those identities that we have here. Do we really celebrate those in a way that's true to them? Do we really support them when something happens back home and they have to take time off of class? Do you really support them when they culturally want to do something, but it doesn't fit into our policies? Right? We use them when we feel it's important for us. And again, I say us because I'm full well in this system, so I'm no better than anybody else. I've done this, right? I've navigated students through this. So big implications of what I did is really, I appreciated hoping just to help, particularly the Indigenous students, make sense of the world that we're living in. One of my best friends read my dissertation work, and she gave me the most powerful statement. She's like, you put into words what I was feeling the whole time. Right? And I think that was super powerful to me, to be able to help them really make sense of this and know that it's not them. Right? Going back to the achievement gap. Knowing that it's not them, it's not an individual deficiency, but knowing that it may be a system that's not built for them. And just for Indigenous researchers to advance Indigenous knowledge. One thing that I do talk about, particularly when it comes to knowledge and also this idea of including, we don't want to, well, I would argue not to be included into this Western white box. That's what got us here. But just legitimize the knowledge that's already out here.
Do you find that, like, if Indigenous research is conducted with, like, you know, kind of like institutional research methods, isn't that colonizing Indigenous?
It's the same, yeah. Well, my friend and I were just talking about, yeah, it's just this big cycle. And I was reading by Gloria a part of his book, and what he was saying was, so if you want a philosopher to read, find Delora Jr., it's really good. He was saying most of the time in academia, so not even thinking about Indigenous people, most of the time, people outside of academia move it because you're already in this box. So I'm not saying it can't happen, but there's a box that's already created, and we decide if we want to participate in it or not. Right? I mean, it's not that simple, but, you know, it's kind of like, now that you know, do you want to get into what you know may harm you in a particular way? But the mitigate education inequalities. So a part of the work that I centered my approach on is this idea of decolonization. And I recognize now it's super cute to be decolonized, super like trendy, right? But it's a hard process. Think about it. It took us 500 years to get to this point, and people are just thinking about this past. It's going to take us that long to really think about what decolonization means. So it's not only a perspective of how to maybe go about life, but it's also about a process. Continually checking yourself, continually thinking about how do you decolonize on a daily basis. So I come from a reservation, and I was around urban natives, right? And so this idea of indigeneity, who gets to define what indigenous means, like that's colonization. And I had to really check myself because I don't have the experiences of urban native. Well, I guess now I'm technically one. But my grounding was in being on the reservation, and so I had to really check myself because I was policing them, right, in a very harmful way. So to me, it's about thinking about your daily life and where are you getting these ideas? Who is saying you should do things in a particular way? And also just really being conscious of history, right? History written by different people. We all know history wasn't necessarily, it's written, it's about perspective, but written in a different way and thinking about history. So it's really walking in a different light. This is one of my favorite quotes by Paulo Freire. I ask people, well, what is the goal of education, right? If I'm in my classes, I've taught a sociology ed class, and this is where I start them. I'm like, what do you think the goal of education is? Because that'll determine how you move in this space. That'll determine how you connect with students. That'll determine what success looks like. And he talks about this dichotomy of liberation and social mobility. Somebody asked me, well, it's not such a dichotomous situation. I said it's not, but I think it has to be simplified in order for you to think it through first, right? And so are we conforming students? Are we conforming them to things that already exist? Are we allowing them to be liberated in a particular way? And then what does liberation mean? That sort of thing. And so one of the things I always go back to is what is the goal of education? What do I think education means for me? I think we don't think about that. Like that was one of my biggest and best exercises in one of my grad classes is I had to write an education philosophy. I really had to sit down and think about what this space means for me. And I don't think we do that. Again, we assume we enter these spaces and we assume we do it for a particular reason, but we don't critically think what those reasons are. And so one of the things I like to provide different resources. So this was printed, I think, in October. So it's from the Association for the Study of Higher Education. It's bringing visibility to the need and interest of Indigenous students by Dr. Reyes and Dr. Shotton, two very great scholars, awesome women. For natives, non-natives, anybody, these are some of the things they provided as kind of guidance of how to maybe do this work. It's a really good document. It's only about 35 pages long. You can get it, it's free. So if you look it up, you can find it. But it really, when I was reading it, it was talking a lot about the things that I talk about a lot and I think about, and it's really comprehensive in that way. And so, a part of what the work that I do now is helping develop partnerships with Native nations, real partnerships. I'm talking about, no, let's not go out and just tout what we do and how we can benefit you as a nation, but what does the nation need from us? One of the big things I think about is, what does student success look like for you as a nation? Because I bet you it's a little bit different than what we think here at the institution. And then how does that inform our work? How does that inform our work? In real relationships. I mean real relationships that take years. Not just one meeting, not just one cute invite to a dinner, like real relationships that take work and that are hard, that you're gonna have to get over in a particular way, right? I think we like to think we're at these institutions, we're really elitist. We like to think a lot of these institutions, a lot of these nations need us here. Is that liberating, or is that being complicit in colonialism? Are we using control? Education as control. And so a couple other things that I want to point out, again, you can probably read it, but this idea of maintaining connections back home is huge. Home, wherever home looks like, right? People often ask me, well, what does education look like for Native students? I'm like, whoa, I don't know. I'm not the all-knowing of Native education higher ed. But what I will say is I think we need to create an institution that's flexible enough for our students to feel like they can be here for as long as they can. And I often, particularly for higher ed administrators, this idea of sense of belonging. What belonging? Why would they want we need to really think about what belonging means here. Does belonging mean assimilation? Does it mean being part of, you know, the football games? And is that something that we want, that is helpful for our students? Like, do they need to belong to be successful? I would argue they need to know what it takes to be successful, and particularly the harms that it may cause. So they can decide what they want to do if they want to be successful in a particular way. They need to know that. They need to know how to navigate this space, truly navigate. Not just, oh, you need to do this because this policy. No, this policy is harmful, and I'm going to tell you why this is harmful, and this is the consequence you may have if you don't do it. We don't have those conversations, right? We're scared to. We don't want to go against this, our employer. We don't want to go against this institution. I mean, train faculty and staff be culture content. Yes, I think that's a given, but I think that has to go beyond one training. We all need to want to learn this. We all need to want to do this work. And I often, you know, people ask, I'm like, well, what's going to happen after? Are you going to debrief? Are you going to continue to have this conversation? That's often met with just like going stairs. And then I was just, some colleagues in the room, we were just in a conversation about wanting to do an event. And we were like, no, you need to think about what your leadership needs to be on board if they want to bring Native people in to commodify them, but they don't want to do any real work. No, we're not going to help with that. Right? It's doing this real committed work. And sometimes I even offer, if you're not about the work, just don't be about the work. Just don't be around here saying that you're committed to the student success, that you're committed to diversity and inclusion. Just don't say it then. I know it's super easier said than done, but it would make it easier. At least students would know what they were getting themselves into. Versus we paint this very rainbow picture about what it means to go to school at these institutions. So I have tons of other different resources. I didn't want to like inundate you because I love to read. So I have tons of books. If you want book recommendations as well. But this one I thought was very relevant, particularly for higher ed on any level.